Student Talk Back Lunch panel discussion as part of our continuing series on the road to the 2012 elections. This week's topic is politics and religion. And as I remind everybody every week, but particularly on a subject as sensitive as this one, we ask not only our panelists, but our audience as well as you weigh in, that even if someone raises a point that you may happen to disagree with, we ask that you weigh in and showing them the same level of respect that you'd hope that they'd show you. Everybody, most people, have very deep-seated thoughts on an issue like this one. And so as is the case every week, we really do want this to be a discussion rather than a debate. We hope you'll all approach it that way. For those of you who I haven't met in the past, my name is Dan Schnurr, and I'm the director of the Jess Unruh Institute of Politics over at the Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. And we sponsor the Road to the White House 2012 series, along with our friends at the Bedrosian Center for Policy and Politics in the School of Policy Planning and Development, and the Center for Communications Leadership out of the Annenberg School for Communication. And each week we take turns, the three of our entities, Bedrosian and CCL and ourselves, hosting these lunches. But it's the kind of thing that we hope you'll participate in, regardless of who takes the lead each week. Because each week we do think that it's a very interesting discussion, and a very valuable discussion, on different facets of the campaign as it's coming together. Joining us for this discussion, moving from the far end of the table forward, at the far end of the table is our friend Matt Klink. Matt is the outgoing president of Sorrell & Associates. Matt's been one of our Unruh Fellows for 3.5 years now, and hopefully this will not be his last opportunity to join us, but on the off chance that it is, please join me in not only welcoming, but thanking Matt Klink for his years of service at USC. Sitting next to Matt is Aaron Wong, who's the membership director of the College of Republicans. Aaron, thank you very much for coming. Next to Aaron is another one of our longtime supporters. Andre Pineda is the president of Pineda Consulting. And among his many, many clients in the 2008 presidential campaign, he polled first for the presidential campaign, then New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson, and later polling with particular specialty in the Latino and Latina community for the Obama-Biden campaign. Andre, thanks as always for joining us. And finally, at this end of the table, Jimena Velazquez Arenas. Jimena is the president of the College of Democrats. Join us in welcoming Jimena. As I think many of you know, at least when the Unruh Institute takes the lead in putting these lunches together, we co-sponsor these lunch discussions with the College of Democrats, with the College of Republicans, and with the Daily Trojan. And joining me here today as co-moderator is the Daily Trojan's online editor, Castalia Medrano. Castalia, thanks for coming.
Okay. To get started, I had a specific question for Andre, actually. As Dan mentioned a few minutes ago, Andre was a Democratic pollster in 2008. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how has polling in religion and politics changed from the last election to this one between Wednesday.
I think the main difference is that religion and sort of like the social issues that go along with religion are going to be less important in 2012 than they were in 2008. The big focus now on everything is the economy and jobs. So I think what will be interesting is what always is the case for these presidential elections, in that Republicans have to worry about not overreaching on religion when it's not the most important issue, but also the Democrats, and specifically President Obama, has to make sure not to look insincere as he's trying to reach out to the independents and some of the Republicans that he's going to need to win in 2012.
Thank you, Andre. I'm going to go to Matt with the next question. And Matt, of course, on some occasions, candidates will talk very overtly and directly about their own religious experience and their own religious faith. But more often than not, it ends up wound up into a discussion of public policy. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how a public policy debate can end up having political implications with voters of particular religious faiths.
Sure. I mean, I think it plays out. You can see it in the Republican primary right now. You have Michelle Bachmann, who made an overt attempt in Iowa to campaign to fundamentalist religious conservatives, and she won the primary, or she won the straw poll. Excuse me. And then you saw Rick Perry hosting the very public, was in Houston at the town hall, and talking about very openly about his religious beliefs. And I think what you're seeing the candidates do, particularly on the Republican side, and if this were a Democratic primary, you would probably see the Democrats try to loop in some tie to religion. They do talk about public policies. They talk about the right to life. They talk about taxes and the need for candidates try to frame. They look for a prism and they use the religion to focus public policy issues to try to connect with the voter. So I think the challenge and Andre put it correctly, the challenge that the Republican candidates are going to face, because right now they're the ones that are fighting each other and they're saying things that may come back to haunt them in a general election, is the challenge is to not become so extreme that, you can read people who are religious. Most people don't wear it overtly on their sleeves, and by being so outward and forward with, God this, Jesus that, I believe this, you can get so far painted to one extreme that you can never get back to the middle, and your uber religion will lose the vast majority of independents. As Andre said, and I totally agree, it's pocketbook issues this election. It might be some foreign policy depending upon what happens in the UN this week and what happens in the Middle East. So that's the pitfall that the Republicans are going to have right now.
Jimena, let's come to you next and then to Aaron. Jimena, there's no question that President Obama, even in his campaign for president in 2008, did make more of an effort to reach out to religious voters than we had seen often in the past from Democratic presidential candidates. But it seems, per Andre's and Matt's discussion, that this is a conversation that tends to take place generally more visibly in the Republican Party. Is that fair?
Yes, it is fair that religion plays, I think, a larger role for the Republican portion in politics. However, when Obama campaigned in 2008, he was the incumbent for the Democrats, and he had to establish that he wasn't Muslim, which was something that 12% of both Democrats and Republicans at the time believed he was. In order to establish himself and let people know what his values were and what his approaches to politics were, it helped a lot for them to know what his background was, and of course, an important part of any background is religion. So that's where he established who he was, and he let himself know what his values were to Democrats as well as to Republicans.
I just wanted to say that.
So I'll add one thing to that, is 40% of voters in the U.S. still don't know what he is.
Phrasing the same question, but to Aaron this time, how do you see religion factoring into the primary?
Yeah, I'll agree with Matt that I think issues that this election cycle will entail will be more popular issues. But remember, religious people are also normal people. They want to know if, what policies will affect their kids getting jobs, how they'll, raise their kids or whatever. So I think these issues will be on the forefront. But I think right now it's interesting because for conservatives, or Rick Perry, he needs to appeal to the conservative base. He's in the primary season right now, but he doesn't want to overreach because those things will warn him when it comes to the general election. We know that elections are won by winning the independent vote, and that can't be won if he's just making very huge statements about faith and religion. Because we'll see those in negative ads that come toward him. So I would agree with Matt that there's a fine line between showing their religious convictions, but also being generic and not talk about policy.
I don't want to keep picking on Andre, but I think a next logical question is, how do you see Obama's campaign tactics shifting depending on what candidate he's facing? Say, Perry, for example, whose campaign has been overtly religious for strong and hasn't really talked about his religion much so far.
One of the things about that is, it sort of brings up the whole difference between the campaign of the candidate and the independent expenditures. So the independent expenditures are the various groups on both sides that are going to be spending even more money than ever before in support of their candidate. I think Romney is playing it really, really, really close to the vest. He doesn't want to talk about Mormonism. He doesn't want to talk about religion much. He wants to keep it on the economy. And so, he's not saying the sorts of things in the primary that are likely to get him in all sorts of trouble. And Democrats would be, independent expenditures or the campaigns would be really careful about how they're going to bring up Mormonism at the risk of seeming unfair. And because on the surface, voters sit there, most voters say it doesn't matter. 68% of voters say that they would support, that they wouldn't be less likely to support a candidate just because they're Mormon. On the flip side, Perry is being anything but careful, and as Matt was saying, he is in effect, putting his religious conviction out there for all to see, and at the same time, therefore, risking things that can come back and hurt him in general. Do I think that that's something that the Obama campaign themselves will bring up all that much? No, because Obama's going to be sitting there and trying to, run a positive campaign on his record and how, and he's going to run against, the Congress more than he's going to run, against Perry and his job on his record on jobs. But I do think that the various IDs out there will go after Perry hard on the things that he said in the primary campaign.
It's a quick follow-up question to Matt. Andre mentioned a minute ago that Romney's obviously been playing Mormon card very close to the vest. So if he's selected as the Republican candidate, at what point do you think he's going to have to confront that and bring it into the public eye?
I would imagine that just as candidate Barack Obama had to confront Reverend Jeremiah Wright, I would imagine that Mitt Romney will probably, if he is the nominee, will give some speech about the role of religion in politics, or at least he has the opportunity to do so. But I think, look, the Democrats want to make the election about a choice. Obama versus somebody else. What the Republicans are going to do is the election's not going to be predicted. Who the Republican candidate is, Obama has failed. We're going to go after Obama because he does not have a record to run on. That's what the two sides are. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily the right approach. I'm just saying that's what the two sides are going to do. And the flip side is Obama, he may try to talk about his record. He's going to bash Congress, and he's going to basically attack whoever the Republican nominee is. We're going to see an incredibly negative 2012 election coming down the road, in part because Obama, whether through his own making or through events over which he had no control, have not yielded the results that he can run effectively to say, look what I've accomplished.
Aaron, I want to go back to something that you talked about earlier that Andre touched on as well, and that is the idea that in a Republican primary, these matters get more discussion than in a general election, less so, for the reasons you discussed earlier. That said, there is some potential value in a appropriately framed religious discussion in the general election. Not so much to persuade undecided voters, but to motivate the Republican base.
Right, yeah, so in 2008 we saw that we had John McCain. He was a moderate to most people, and then he picked Sarah Palin as his running mate. That really excited the Republican base, and that can happen too for the next run-up that we pick for the Republican nomination. And I think that, as what Matt said, it'll be interesting.
Move the microphone.
Yeah. It'll be interesting how Romney deals with Mormonism, because for Americans, this is a new religion that we haven't seen before. In terms of presidential candidates, I think we have to reassure the American people that he doesn't want to establish Mormonism as a church for America, that he's all for the separation of church and state, and there'll be something that he will have to make clear on his candidacy, or else that's going to blow up.
Okay, man, let me ask you a question from a slightly different perspective. As we've done on this panel, and as often takes place in national political conversations, a discussion of religion and politics, particularly as it relates to the Republican Party, tends to center on issues like abortion, same-sex marriage, and other more traditionally defined social and cultural issues. But there does seem to be an emerging set of voices from the political left that talks about issues like environmental protection, helping the poor, talking about religion in a different policy context. Is that Yeah, is that a few isolated voices, or is that a sign that the religious-based conversation in politics may be evening out between the two parties?
In terms of the religious-based evening out, I think it is fairly even. You do have the stereotypical Democrats are all secular belief, but that's not true, and polls consistently show it. That you do have religious people in both sides. The question about abortion and gay marriage, that surfaces a lot more when you don't have as big a problem with the economy as you currently do. That's why they're sort of in the background right now. You're not going to have candidates winning based on what their stance is with gay marriage or abortion. You're going to have candidates winning on what their stance is on what we should do with taxes, whether we should cut spending or increase spending or give more power to the federal government, whatever that is. That's where the debate is right now. Hence, it depends on what other issues are happening in American policy that shape those stances. However, polls do show from the past, I think it's the Gallup poll 2011, show that as more Americans are getting college educations, the interest that they have for the environment is increasing as well. So, in that sense, yes, it is evening out.
Okay, this question is for the whole panel then. So Hannah was just talking about how the demographics and religion can relate to each other in terms of politics. As America is becoming more increasingly diverse, how do you see the role of religion changing in politics in future years?
I'll start. I think that on a couple levels. If you look at the Latino voting bloc, it's not, you can't say that the Latino voting bloc is solely Roman Catholic at this point. There's a growing number of evangelical Latinos out there. I think the African American population is very religious. I think that the Jewish vote in 2012, they're not as rock solid Democrat as one would think, in part due to perceptions and actual statements by the president that have been ambiguous at best over the future of Israel in the peace process. So I think that as America becomes more diverse, the ability to put people into boxes because they're religious, that, the Catholic vote is automatically going to go Democrat, and the African-American religious vote is going to go, or the African-American vote is going to go Democrat. I think that with some exceptions, like Muslim voters, I think they're the strongest Democratic voting bloc. I think they're under like 90 some odd percent, and even stronger than the African-American population. I just don't think that the boxes are moving around a little bit, is what I'm getting at, and that there will be some change, somewhat due to religion, but I think we're simplifying it too much if we think that religion is the reason why people are moving around just because their religious views are getting more diverse. There's this overlying blanket on everything that is the economy right now, that no matter if you're a fundamentalist Christian in Iowa or a Roman Catholic in Seattle, Washington, you're concerned about the economy, and religion may be important, and you'll frame issues through your moral values, but that blanket is a pretty thick blanket right now, and that's what's focusing everybody's attention.
I want to add on to what you said, Matt. I think it is true that we're simplifying this too much. Religion is a really good predictor right now, and it fluctuates. It fluctuates as time goes by, but religion right now is a good way to predict how people will vote. The more often you go to church, the more likely you are to vote conservative. However, in 2008, we saw that the religious right divided like they haven't divided before. You have Protestants who generally vote conservative, divided in African American and white, even evangelical Protestant. The African American Protestants voted really in high numbers for Obama in 2008, whereas the white Protestants stayed with McCain. And that was something that we'd seen, but not in that level of division before. So as the denominators change, again, you can't take religion as the one deciding factor. It is important, it plays a strong role, but other factors affect it as well. So we need to be cautious of those.
And I want to follow up very quickly on the point that Jimena just made, because it really is, at least right now, at this point in American political history, of significant import. There was a time for many, many years in American politics when the single greatest indicator as to whether an individual would vote Republican or Democrat was their income level. And the higher their income level, the more likely they were to vote Republican. And over the last decade, 15 years, that indicator has changed. As Democrats have become more successful at reaching out to higher income voters, as Republicans have figured out how to talk to a populist, economically blue-collar but socially conservative audience, that indicators changed. Right now, our panelists have done an excellent job of talking about how this may be changing in the future. But at this point in American history, the single greatest indicator of whether an individual will vote Republican or Democrat is the frequency with which they attend religious services. And an individual who attends religious services, whether a church or a synagogue or another house of worship, once a week or more frequently, is statistically much more likely to vote Republican. And an individual who attends those same houses of worship less frequently are much more likely to vote Democrat. So I think the panelists have done an excellent job of talking about how that dynamic is becoming less clear moving forward as the electorate becomes more complicated. But at least right now, in 2011, as a jumping off point, the frequency of religious participation becomes a very stark indicator. Andre, what should we be looking for as indicators of that dynamic changing?
I think one of the things that's interesting is the way that the more things change, the more they stay the same. You know, in Europe, they would just be thinking it's crazy that we're having this discussion. This religion and politics. They look at the Republican primary right now and just think, how is it that the candidates are talking like this? They, in the UK, they would sit there and say the most conservative UK MP, is liberal compared to your blue dog Democrats. And so I think one thing that's a constant about the U.S. is that the way that religion continues to be a part of politics. It's just it'll be interesting to see how, as you're saying, how it changes. So we're going to have more and more Latino voters. Right now, they're only about 9% of the electorate. But they actually represent 15% of the population now, and it's only going to get bigger. As Matt was saying, they're not always going to. They're not all Catholic. The biggest growth in Latinos are Latino evangelicals. They vote more Republican. Does this trend continue? Another one is just this whole idea, and this is kind of the card that Huntsman is playing, which is like the way that he's been more explicit about his Mormonism than Romney has, and the way that he's done that is that he's trying to appeal to sort of like this post-evangelical religiosity in the U.S., which is which he would call I'm spiritual, not religious. What happens there? You're still having the people believing in God, but not attaching to the same old religions before. Do we see a diminishing proportion of people that attend services while we still have the same amount believing in God? These are some of the things that we'll look for that will suggest a change coming.
And Aaron, let me ask you this question. Andre makes a very correct point, which is a political observer based in Europe or in other places around the globe might look at this discussion with some confusion and/or ridicule. That said, statistics show that the United States tends to be a more religiously oriented society than many of the other Western democracies. So therefore, I guess, to wind up this part of the discussion before we open it up to questions from our audience, if the United States citizens outside the realm of politics tend to be more religiously oriented, is it realistic to expect that our politics will not have a significant religious influence to them?
Right. So I'm from New Zealand originally, and to have an even discussion like this about religion and politics would be absurd. That's what Andre was saying. So I think that, the thing about church is that it does form the worldviews of most believers, and that does influence politics. And if you're going every single Sunday to a religious service where they talk about sanctity of life, or they talk about the importance of like serving your neighbor or whatever, that will inform your politics. And I think that's something unique to American politics, is that religion is protected first by the First Amendment, and that people are free to express that. And I think religion will continue to be a big issue in America because it's part of America's DNA. versus like other countries, like even my own, New Zealand.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. At this point, about halfway through, we'd like to open it up to questions from people in the audience.
Before we get started, and I know who you are, but you're going to have to do it anyway. Once again, just as we remind you every week, before you ask a question, number one, if you can tell us who you are. And number two, as I said earlier, even if you're going to be asking a question of someone with whom you may disagree on a particular issue, we ask that you remember that that person might disagree with you, but that they're not your enemy, and that you phrase your question to them with the appropriate level of respect. I know, Aaron, you were ready to be completely disrespectful, so I had to get there.
We're good now. My name's Aaron Taxi. I'm a sophomore majoring in international relations. And Matt, you mentioned the voting patterns of Muslim Americans. And I'm wondering if discourse about Islam is going to have a role in the general election, be it mobilizing the Muslim vote to vote against the Republicans who have been bashing them, or mobilizing members of the Republican base who are attracted to the rhetoric of figures like Herman King, who routinely bash the role of Islam in America.
My opinion on that is basically that for the Republicans, it's not going to matter. You're not going to find a lot of Muslims or people who are you're not going to find a lot of Muslims who are going to vote Republican anyway. So when the subject matter is discussed, it's going to be more in the context of a foreign policy issue. I think that for Democrats, it's a base vote. I think that they'll do what they need to do, probably not overtly, because again, presidential politics right now, we're realistically talking about 9 states and independent voters. Obama has to pull, Democrats are going to vote for Obama, Republicans are going to vote for anybody else. You're looking for independent voters in about 9 states that are going to make the difference between who gets elected. So talking to Muslims, I think the Democrats will do it probably through direct mail, knocking on doors, phone banks, etc. Maybe going to some of the mosques. You're not going to see Obama do something overt. His entreaties to the Muslim world on his apology tour have been an abject failure. And I think that he's been roundly criticized by people in the middle on that. So he'll deal with it to make sure that they turn out and vote, which I think is going to be the biggest problem for the Obama base right now. And I think for the Republicans, they're going to talk about dealing with radical Islam, not Muslims in general, but that radical element to try to make sure that they frame it in a national security foreign policy context, not a religious context.
Follow-up question for Andre on this. Just as the Jewish vote is not large enough on a national basis to make a significant impact, but can make a difference in swing states like Florida and Pennsylvania and potentially New Jersey, there's growing evidence that the Muslim vote, while small on a national basis as well, can be a particularly important in a key swing state like Michigan. So as the Arab American community organizes more aggressively, and as we see evidence of followers of Islam in this country becoming politically involved, is there, either in 2012 or in future elections, a growing opportunity for either party in a swing state or other particular areas?
So you can expect that that the administration and more to the point, the campaign is reaching out to Muslims in a big way. In Michigan, field. Let's make sure that we get these folks out to vote. Let's make sure that we raise money here in a big way. And but I think Matt is right that in no way is this going to become sort of like part of a larger, broader discussion, even about something as broad as tolerance. There might be tolerance discussed, but this isn't exactly going to be the way that they're going to bring it up. There's not a payoff at the greater election, but there's so much that you can do online, on the field, with direct mail, and to raise money and get out votes, and you can bet that they're doing it.
Other questions?
I would like to quote you on saying now that the U.S. is more religious, so it seems to be more religiously oriented than other countries. And then you also mentioned that, for example, in Europe, people would be like very amazed of having even this debate. So I'm from Germany, I'm quite amazed of having this debate. And I would like to say, like, what I feel like is that in Europe, it's not like people are not as outspoken about their religion because it's more inclusive. It's saying everybody has their own way of life, their own religion, and we'll just, as a politician, I'm going to present you with a common ground. I'm going to try and find values that we can all share. So if whether it be abortion, homosexual marriage, or environmentalism, and then on the basis of that, we can build a society, and everybody still lives the way they want. But we
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but do you have a question for one of our panelists?
Yes, and like, so I'm just wondering, it seems like here it's more about one group pushing their own agenda and pushing that onto other people, and how as a society, because that's the end of the day what a country is supposed to be, how does that fit in together? Like, so how can they be inclusive when they're pushing their way of life onto other people?
Very good question, and I think any of the panelists who'd like to, you can take a shot at it. I guess the way I frame it, for those who might not have heard it, and to offer a little bit of historical perspective, is candidates of both parties, historically, when they talk about their religious faiths, tend to be most successful when they find a way to do it in a very inclusive basis. Okay? Here's what you and I share, here's what you and I believe, as opposed to in an exclusive basis saying, here's what I believe, and here's why what I believe is better than yours. Given the natural tensions between talking about one's religious faith in an inclusive versus an exclusive way, any lessons that can be drawn from any of our panelists as this relates to the campaign going forward?
I want to jump in on that. I think the United States is a really odd country. It's very fluid, both in religion and in terms of the population it has. The diversity greatly affects the agenda of the politicians that they want to, spur this group or that group. Again, if you want to have a viable chance at being president, candidates generally don't try to be exclusive, like Dan said. If you do, you're not going to make it very far. Herman McCain, like you already saw, he's having a lot of trouble now reconciling Muslims, which could make a huge difference. Perry is also having a hard time reconciling the Jewish population in swing states like Florida that can make up to 5 to 7% of the electorate, which in a swing state makes all the difference, because he was pointing out one of his favorite books, I think is Changing of Tides or something along that nature, which encourages Christians to evangelize Jews, and they're not very receptive to the idea. So in that sense, of course not. In that sense, you have to be careful if you want to be taken seriously as a candidate to not play the exclusive role. But it is a little odd, I think, like we discussed earlier, the United States is a very religious country still. Most people say that they feel uncomfortable when they mingle religion and politics together, but realistically, when they vote, it makes a difference, and we've seen that constantly over the years. So it's just a particularity, I would say, of American politics.
Would any of the panelists like to weigh in on this, or should we go on?
Well, I'll just say that one important thing that happened in relatively recent times, recent for some of us on the panel, not recent for the rest of you, but but it was was the rise of the Christian right.
I read about that.
Don't start with it. And so what it was is, these evangelicals were always there, but they weren't in sort of a political movement, and some Ralph Reed and other Christian operatives, Republican operatives, recognized that there was a big opportunity here to really get them mobilized and get them voting, and it became wildly successful because what happens in primaries, of course, is that is that you have the base of each side. So you have, the way that I like to put it, you have your wacky liberals showing up for Democratic primaries, your wacky conservatives for Republican primaries. Well, to put it impolitely, the Christian conservatives made a nice component for the the wacky conservatives for the primary, and were able to wield all sorts of influence, and hence it completely shaped the way that we talk about it today.
Matt or Aaron, do you want to weigh in on this?
No, I think Andre said it. That was a great answer.
Okay. Others? Yes?
So you kind of briefly touched on...
And you are, I'm sorry?
Sorry, my name's Kimberly Bailey. I'm first year at the School of Policy Planning and Development, getting my MPA. You kind of briefly touched on the idea of religion being influenced in foreign policy issues, and especially with everything that's going on in the world between the Arab Spring and the UN vote coming up. Can you weigh in on how you think that people are going to present that? Do you think that their personal religion is going to influence the way they represent these issues or the way they address them?
You know, we talked about how an individual's religious grounding influences the way they talk about public policy. And Matt, you talked a little bit earlier, in particular, about the debate over Palestinian statehood. Would you or any of the other panelists like to weigh in on this?
Well, I just think if you're of Jewish faith, even if you're not of Jewish faith, and you see what has been said by Barack Obama trying to jumpstart a peace process that was failed before he even came into the picture. Nevertheless, his statements of a year ago at the UN talking about Israel-Palestine negotiations, and then knowing what's happening now, and if you're a Jewish voter, and the Jewish voters are very, very strongly pro-Israel, you're not very happy with a Democratic president who historically has been a check the box for the Democratic Party. So I think clearly their faith is going to influence how they vote on election day. And on the flip side of that, you have a small but vocal Muslim community that is overwhelmingly Democrat, that also is probably more of the progressive side of the Democratic Party, that is also anti-Israel. So you have the party itself tearing at each other quietly, but nonetheless there is quite a bit of tension there. And then you have, interestingly enough, you have very conservative, socially conservative Republicans who are ardently pro-Israel, in part because strong religious convictions, strong on national defense, a bulwark of, steady democracy in the Middle East. And people look at the Arab Spring right now, that it's not turning out so well. If you look at the countries that have supposedly had these democratic revolutions, I mean, democratic revolution, small d democratic, and it may not end up where we as Americans want them to be. So I think that, again, it's more of a foreign policy issue, but people with their religious convictions, again, going back to the Israeli or the Jewish voter issue, that may switch how they vote come November. And Obama's clearly worried about it. There was a big article in the New York Times, I think either at the end of last week or the beginning of this week, that talked about the campaign freaking out and having to go back to Jewish voters to reassure them that Obama's where he needs to be. And look at his statements today. He totally changed his tune from what he said this year versus last year at the UN General Assembly. And people now are going to be wondering, well, which Obama are we getting? So it's going to be, the religious part of it influences it.
Andre, you look like you agree completely.
Yeah. So to weigh in a little bit, I mean, there's definitely parts of that I very much agree with, and the part that I agree with is that the Obama campaign is freaking out in a big way about everything that's going on with Israel, and is doing all sorts of damage control there. The thing that I don't agree with is to put it one way, that the Jewish vote is monolithic on Israel, because it's not. And there's what so much of why they're freaking out right now is not, but it isn't all about this. So much of why there's the perception that they're freaking out right now is because of the special election that we just lost. We Democrats just lost in New York. And what happened there was a perfectly good Jewish Democratic candidate lost because of his position on Israel. But a lot, and also because of the rest of the sort of frustration with the Obama record. But even that district doesn't look like the rest of Jews in America. That district is a very Orthodox Jew district, and it's the Orthodox Jews that are monolithic on, for the most part, on Israel. And if you're not, just as pro Israel pro-Netanyahu as possible, then they're going to vote against you. But again, that's not everybody. And the way that I always like to talk about it, as an outsider, as a non-Jew, is so you have AIPAC and you have J Street, and these two sort of Jewish organizations that try to influence the public debate in D.C. AIPAC has been around forever. And is one of the strongest lobbying organizations in the U.S. J Street came about relatively recently. It's younger Jews tend not to be Orthodox and are much more liberal and not big fans of Netanyahu. That sort of represents sort of like the difference that there is in the American electorate among Jews. They're not all monolithic voters that way. And there was one other thing that I was going to add on that, but now I blanked out what it is. So
I just want to add on to what Andre said. The perception that the Jewish vote, like he said, is monolithic is completely not true. The reason that happened in New York with the election that was lost was because a great percentage of the Orthodox Jewish vote is in New York. And they're the ones that are more conservative towards their policies in Israel. The liberal Jewish vote, which is what we have the majority of in the states, in most states, is a lot friendlier towards Obama's policies, where he says that both states need to compromise, both Palestine and Israel. And I think that although that's been a position that has caused a lot of controversy, because we've been Israel's ally for so long, and we cannot contradict anything they say because that's just that's taboo. I think it was a good move on his behalf because it allows to have slightly different dialogue that we haven't had previously, and it also encourages the Muslim and Jewish section of our American population to consolidate under the Democrats, which I think is a smart move.
So says the director of the College of
And the thing that I was going to add, and of course it's a polling thing. So the perception that Obama's way down with Jews right now, which he is, but he's way down with everybody right now. And he's not more. So you hear that with he's got a Hispanic problem. Well, he does, but he's also got a problem with Jews. He's got a problem with, to a lesser extent, but even African Americans are down. He's got a big white problem, but he's down with everybody. And that's part of the discussion here too.
And I'll take moderator's prerogative here to weigh in on this particular topic because it's one that I've spent a good amount of time on. And I think all three of the panelists who weighed in on this are right to a certain point. But what I'd suggest to you, at least as it relates to domestic politics and the religious breakdown in the electorate, my guess as a Jewish voter is that most American Jews will vote for Obama in spite of his position on Middle Eastern issues. And while there is a certain cohort that Andre has correctly identified that's represented by the organization J Street, most American Jews are not particularly comfortable with his position on Israel and in the Middle East, but are so overwhelmingly supportive of him on a much broader range of domestic and foreign policy issues, they'll probably look past even this important issue to the Jewish community in order to support him for the reasons. Okay, now I have to take a moderator.
Next question, yeah.
In the 1960s...
Sorry, what's your name?
I'm sorry, my name's Anna, and I'm a first-year policy student at SPED. In the 1960 election, one of the major charges that was leveled against John Kennedy was that he would be, as a Catholic, he would be answerable to the Pope. And I think a lot of, I don't know if there's anyone proven it, but from my experience, I'd be fairly certain that Mormons are even more in lockstep with their religious leadership than are Catholics. And anyone who knows anything about Utah politics definitely knows that the church has an extremely strong influence on politics there. So if Romney or maybe more relevant Huntsman were to get the vote, do you think that's a charge that would be leveled against him, that he would be answerable rather to the Mormon, I don't know what they're called, their leadership? And do you think that is a relevant concern?
I don't think you have to worry about Huntsman, but
Aaron, you got that. Sure. And it's interesting because even the positions that Romney takes on same-sex marriage, same-sex research, all the typical issues that Mormons would be against, he's actually for. So it seems that he's more weighed by public opinion, maybe more Mormon church. Very critical against John. And I don't think he's made a statement saying that he's going to make the Mormon church the state church or something, or that he even has that issue. So I think just looking at his report, I don't think he really asks to be Mormon church and that sort of thing.
I'm sorry, I already said that he does or does not?
That's all.
Well, I would add too that I don't know what the strictly numeric breakdown is of Catholic, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, etc. But the Mormon population nationwide is growing quite rapidly, in part because look at the people out walking in your neighborhood every once in a while. They're Mormons. I mean, they're out trying to bring people into the faith. And I think that, as that happens, the Mormon religion has become more mainstream in terms of perception. I mean, they don't consider themselves not mainstream, but among the broader populace at large, it's becoming more. How many of you know someone who's a Mormon? I bet most of you do. So, I mean, knowing someone breeds that level of familiarity, which makes things more socially acceptable. And I don't think it's the same as comparing it to 1960 because America is a strikingly different country. But there probably are some loose parallels, but I don't think it's going to be an issue.
And so just because I looked at the NBC Wall Street Journal this morning, so it's 53% Protestant, 28% Catholic, and then 1% Jewish, 2% Mormon in terms of the American electorate. And in terms of whether this will be asked, yeah, it will definitely be asked. My sense is I'll have a good answer, but you're asking who's going to be asked, no question.
Yeah, in the back.
Okay, my name is Fritz. I'm a junior political science major. I think one of the key differences demographically in this election versus in the 2008 elections, sort of the big elephant in the room, no pun intended, is the presence of the Tea Party. The Tea Party generally is focused on economic issues, but most of the people who would associate with the Tea Party are probably of very strong religious persuasion. And my question is, how has the resurgence of the Tea Party affected discourse over religious politics in this country, and to what extent has it had an influence, and what kind of influence has it had?
Well, I mean, I think that there's been what's happened here is that these two sort of trends came together, which is so you did have this group that was particularly concerned about the economy and so forth, which is the Tea Party, and then you do have the Christian conservatives, and they aren't one and the same. The Tea Party came up for its own separate thing, and if you ask the Tea Party, do you know that much about the Christian right, or do you participate in it? Almost half of them will say no. But that doesn't mean that they're not Christian conservative. They're just not part of the movement. The flip side is true. The Tea Party is bigger than the Christian conservative movement. And what's happened is just that there's been these two separate strains of republicanism that have some overlap, that have come together, that have created an enthusiasm on the Republican side that wasn't there before. We saw it in 2010, and the fearful thing for me is that continues in 2012.
You can thank George W. Bush for the creation of the Tea Party, and I think that in a large part and I'm not saying that in a positive way. I say that because these were people that were Republicans before, and they abandoned the party because what they saw was George Bush was a big spending Republican. And I'm a Bush voter, two-time Bush voter. And you saw people who said, we have to stop this madness. And they have been a force ever since. And I think, now they run these surveys all the time. Oh, the Tea Party is more unpopular than ever. Look at the issues we're talking about right now. They have profoundly influenced the national debate, certainly at the 2010 congressional level, and definitely, at least at this stage of the election, for the 2012 election. Going back to what your question was, though, and what Andre said, it's like those concentric, those circle diagrams where you have an overlap. They're separate, but then they merge in the middle, and there's probably a good, 35% that has some type of an overlap where they are religious.
That'll be a Venn diagram.
Thank you. Venn diagram. No, and it's, yeah. So, no, and there's some overlap, but they have Tea Party folks, they're all about economics. And that's what their central focus is. And that's what the debate's going to be about in 2012.
I want to add on one more thing to the discussion, is when the Tea Party was first formed, the Tea Party caucus was first formed, it gained a lot of popularity immediately. Like you said, people were really enraged that government spending had increased so much under the Bush administration. But afterwards, when you're starting to see this movement where they're falling down in attractiveness in polls because they've become more religious, now they're also bringing in the context of religiosity needs to be increased in government, as well as government needs to be smaller. And that immediately makes the majority of Americans feel uncomfortable. So they gained a lot of force in the beginning, and now they're shrinking that down again because of this second context that they've added.
Aaron, the other panelists have weighed in on the Tea Party. Do you have any thoughts to close out this discussion?
Right, yeah, I think the Tea Party has created so many elements within American politics. They had their own debate last week, senior debate, and I don't think any other mobilized group has had that so far in this debate season. So I think they are still a very powerful force, and I don't think they've really lost any beliefs or anything, but they're still a very powerful force within American politics.
The one thing I'll say is, I mean, no question, very powerful, but also you hear their name a lot in the primary, you won't hear it so much in the general.
And the Venn diagram would probably show that.
Castelli and I decided that we could easily go for another hour or two with questions for our panel. But in fairness to them, we're instead going to wrap this up and thank them. So thank you to Matt Klink, to Aaron Wong, to Andre Pineda, and to Jimena Velazquez-Arenas for a terrific discussion. Thank you to my co-moderator, Castelli Medrano, and to the Daily Trojan for doing these with us every week. To the college Republicans and college Democrats for their participation on an ongoing basis. And to our partners at the Center for Communications Leadership, and I apologize, I misspoke earlier. The official name of our other partner is the Bedrosian Center on Governance and the Public Enterprise at the School of Policy Planning and Development, and we are very lucky to have the Bedrosian Center's director, Dan Nesmini, here with us today also. So Dan, thanks to you and to Jeff Cowan and your colleagues at your respective institutes for the work you do in helping bring these programs together. Next week, the Center for Communications Leadership will be hosting a discussion on Texas versus California, economic myths versus reality, featuring their senior fellow, Narda Zarkino. She's done extensive research into the economy and social ground of both states. It should be a fascinating discussion. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you here next week.